Okay, so Scott and I are going to do a quick introduction to all things X. And what we're going to do is talk a little bit about each of our areas of research. So Talk About X is designed to be a multi and an interdisciplinary conference. We have folks here from history of art, we have folks from astrophysics. So we have this very purposeful, entirely mixed up subject area levels of discussion. One of the reasons why Scott and I are so passionate about this is when we started to Talk About X a couple of years ago in 2015, Scott and I realized, and the rest of our team realized, that we are a kind of a weird department in that we're a really multi and interdisciplinary group of people. So, for example, I'm a political historian. Scott is a geneticist. Scott and I have worked together for over a decade. And one of the things that we have to do is be able to communicate our ideas, our research, to each other in a way that shows off why I love political history so much and why Scott loves plants and genetics so much, and explain the importance of that. Right? And that was one of the kind of the features of Talk About X and what it was we wanted to try and get folks to do. So we're going to start today by having a quick conversation between me and Scott about some of our research. We'll do the same thing tomorrow with two of our other fantastic members of staff, Jess and Mona, and we'll present there each time a kind of a sciences side and an arts side to research. Okay, so for me, as I said, I'm a political historian. I look at essentially what happens inside this building. So this is the Palace of Westminster. This is where the British House of Commons and House of Lords sit. It's in London. It's where all British politics kind of focuses and centralizes around. I'm really interested in the ways in which politicians discuss ideas, frame ideas, and present ideas and analyze ideas. Right? So it doesn't really much matter what you think of any of these people. You can appreciate the fact that the words that they have, the ideas that they discuss, the concepts that they use, and the definitions and approaches to language that they use frame and shape so much of how we understand British politics, British society, British culture, and the British economy. Right? So these people, whether you like them or not, are the kind of one of the most important groups of people with regards to speaking the English language, in that they shape so much of how we understand and conceptualize the world around us. Okay. So what we have then is that these people and their words in Parliament are important. Every word that they say is recorded. Every word that they say in Parliament is recorded in what's called Hansard. Hansard is the almost verbatim, so almost word for word account of British political speeches in Parliament. We are somewhat unique as a nation in having such a long history of parliamentary debate, and Hansard has really come to the fore in the modern period, so from about 1800-ish all the way through, to provide us with an amazing amount of information on British parliamentary speeches. So how this works then is you have a Hansard reporter. This is the woman on the right here taking the notes. They sit in the chamber, so in the House of Commons or the House of Lords, in 10-minute blocks, and they go around in 10-minute cycles. They then take notes that look something like this, and then they transfer that up into full debates, full records of the debates. So these are the House of Commons. If you look there at the third one from the left, you can see that full thick book covers the 21st of March to the 31st of March in 1993-4. Right? So these debates are lengthy and wordy. Politicians like to hear themselves talk. So these debates are lengthy and wordy, but every single word of every single speech is captured here. And it's published the next day. So this is a debate from Parliament yesterday. Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, was talking about the economic crime bill, which is being discussed in Parliament just now, as a result of some of the sanctions that we're putting on Russians at the moment. So this was spoken yesterday afternoon. It's not even 24 hours ago yet, and you can get full access to the entire debate through the Hansard database. So that's Hansard. And what we have is that Hansard is corrected and updated and fixed. So we have an example here of a message to an MP, Jim Sheridan, and the Hansard reporter has said, "What did you say about the SNP, the Scottish National Party? It sounded like you said big fairies." And then the response comes back from the MP to say, "No, it's big fearties," which is a Scottish word for people who are afraid. So this is checked and corrected to make sure that it's as accurate as it can possibly be. So what we have then is at Glasgow, a unique version of this corpus. So we have a corpus. A corpus is just a collection, a body of texts. We have the Hansard corpus, which allows us to search and investigate these speeches. So we have 202 years worth of speeches from 1803 to 2005. Within that, we have 1.6 billion words. So that would take you about 560 years if you were handwriting it out, or it would take you 55 years to sit and read all of those words silently in your head. Those 1.6 billion words are made up into 7.5 million speeches, and we have just over 40,000 individual speakers recorded here. So that's MPs, lords, people speaking in Parliament. So what we have then is, in essence, too many words. 1.6 billion words is too many for a historian to be able to look through, understand, draw anything out of. So what we also have at Glasgow is what's called the Historical Thesaurus of English. The thesaurus is a way of understanding meaning, ideas. I can just see Alina's mentioned in the chat. Alina worked on the thesaurus as well. We have an approach to understanding language that takes the kind of the falseness of the dictionary. So if you think of a normal dictionary, it builds everything up into an alphabetical order. That's fake and weird. What the thesaurus does is allows us to see concepts and meanings and all of the words that we have had for that concept or that meaning at any particular point. So if we think of the color red, for example, in the thesaurus, you can see every single word that speakers of English have had for the last 1,500, 1,800 years, all available in one group. So if we take another example, let's say this concept of being uncivilized. Right, so what it means to be savage, what it means to be barbaric, uncivilized, rude. These words here represent the history of the British, or the English approach to incivility. Right? All of these words here are all of the words we have ever had in English to discuss somebody or something that we think to be barbaric. Right, and the way it works is the older ones are on the top left, so Old English, and then it gets more modern as you go through down the list, down to pre-civilized in 1953. So what we can do at Glasgow is smoosh those two things together. Right, use the thesaurus to understand these concepts, these ideas, and then use the Hansard corpus to analyse what shows up in Parliament. So this is a search of the concept of uncivilized in the British Hansard, the British Parliament's Hansard corpus. And what it does is it allows us to see the ways in which these concepts have been brought up and discussed in Parliament. So you have the name of the speaker, for example, you have the exact text that it comes from, you have the year, all of that kind of stuff shows up through, right? When we look at this, we can see that there are 2,044 references to the uncivil. So there are 2,044 references to a person, a place, a thing, where they are being discussed as being uncivil or barbaric. So we've already gone from 1.6 billion words down to 2,044. If we look at that in some more detail, we can see that there are 877 examples where a specific country is mentioned as being uncivilized. So you can see Ireland is at the top, then Northern Ireland, then India, then Russia, Scotland, and so on. Right, so that's 877 examples of a particular country being called uncivilized, barbaric. Again, looking at this in some more depth, we can see the ways in which this discussion changes over time. So we've got each block here each row is a decade. And then the blue references are when it's discussing things that are internal, so British things being uncivilized, so British places, British practices. Green is foreign, anything outside of the UK. And then yellow and red are Ireland and Northern Ireland. So at this level, we can start to see really important changes, really important discussions in British politics. So you've got 1829, the Catholic Relief Act in Parliament. So that was the emancipation of Catholics in Ireland. Or we can see in the 1960s to the 1990s, the Troubles in Northern Ireland. So the civil war, in essence, that was going on in Northern Ireland. And again, even at this really quite broad level, we can see how these work. If we look at a heat map of this, so the way this works is, again, you've got the time, the decade running along the bottom, you've got the countries going up the left here, and then the darker the color, the more references there were, right? The more references to something being uncivilized or barbaric there are. So if we look at this, we can see Scotland, for example, has this kind of almost always being discussed as being barbaric. We compare that against England. England has less of it. But we can also here see really specific examples of things that have happened in British history. Right? So you see this really dark box around New Zealand in the 1840s. This is because of the Treaty of Waitangi. And that was the first treaty between the British Crown and the Maori tribes in New Zealand, where there was the establishment of the colony of New Zealand. Right? And so there's lots of discussion of this in Parliament. We can also see, for example, in China in the 1860s, the Opium Wars, the impact of the Opium Wars with China. Right? So even again at this big, broad level, we can start to see the impact of world events on the discussions that's happening in Parliament. If we look at the late 20th century, you can see the Gulf Wars in Iraq, 1990 to 1991, and then again 2003 to 2011. So you can see that discussion there of Iraq. So what we have then as this snapshot is a view of going from the study of history that looks something like this. So this is my own handwriting. This is me sitting in the archives writing out by hand individual speeches. But then we get to this 1.6 billion words. So we've got this kind of deluge of words that means that going back to this becomes an almost impossible task. How do we get from this out to 1.6 billion words worth of discussion? Well, the only way we can do that is through what's called big data in the humanities, using things like the Hansard corpus, using things like the thesaurus, in order to be able to investigate at a really broad scale these 202 years worth of parliamentary speeches, those 1.6 billion words. So my research then looks at the way in which we can use these really large data sets, these really large corpuses, in order to investigate and understand changes in politics and changes in political speech. Scott.
So hopefully when I give my part of the presentation, the wind won't sound like it's trying to blow down my house, but apologies if it starts to get that way. Andrew said that he and I work on very different things. So from my perspective as a biologist, I would say we have a problem. The problem that I'm most interested in, and that I was most interested in with my PhD, was related to the number of people that we have on the planet these days and the amount of space that we have to produce the resources needed to keep those people alive and healthy. Particularly as a plant biologist, I was interested in the space that we have to grow the food for all of the people, which is a number that is increasing at an increasing rate. We have a problem with the climate, which a lot of people will be familiar with. And a side issue of that, or one of the parts of the issue there, is that through various mechanisms, the salt levels in the soil gets higher and higher to a point where plants can no longer grow. And so with this heat map here, you can see that some of the places that are most affected, i.e. the ones that are not just grey, are also in the places that are the warmest on the planet, and that's where it's nicest and happiest for plants to grow, especially a lot of our calorie-producing food crops that sustain life on the planet. So if the salt is going up there, then our question is, how do we solve the problem of salt toxicity for essential crops? And at this point, I often find that when I'm talking to people about my research, I get this question. Do plants have DNA? Do plants have genes? Are they like us? And the answer is yes. The genetic model organism, so I wasn't using crops, I was using an organism that can stand in place for them, is called Arabidopsis. It's this tiny, tiny weed. And the reason we use it in labs is because it's small, so you can handle it fairly easily. It goes from a seed to producing more seeds for the next generation much faster than an actual full-size crop would. You get many, many seeds, which means that you can then do lots of experiments with them. We know what all of the genes say. We don't necessarily know what they do, but we know what the sequence of all of them says if you read it out letter by letter. And so for that reason, we do the research on that and then go looking for the equivalent genes in the full-size crops once we've got a general handle on what we want to do and what we want to find out. So using this model organism, step one in my research was to cause random DNA changes to thousands of these seeds, plant those seeds in a salty environment, a bit like the crops they're dealing with out there in the real world. And then if any of them were to grow in that toxic, unforgiving environment, we would take those ones that survived and investigate what was different about them through that random mutation that we'd caused to their DNA at the start. And what that actually looks like in practice is a lot of time with your hands inside a sterile environment in a hood that's circulating the air so that nothing gets cross-contaminated. And then here on the right-hand side, you can see a close-up photograph of what these thousands of seeds look like on these clear jelly plates, a bit like the way you would grow bacteria. You can also do that with plants. And so some that manage to create these tiny, tiny leaves, that's better than the majority of the seeds that you can see there that basically started and then very quickly gave up. Those would be picked off with tweezers, rescued onto normal soil and investigated. And to give you an analogy of how genes work, think of the university structure. We've got the principal who sits at the top and tells us all what we need to do. And the way that he tells us that is actually through a network of people who sit below him at senior management level. So you're in education here in this environment. We have a vice principal for learning and teaching. There's also one for research. There are also many others for other things the university does. And underneath each of those, we have people also in senior management. And I think we do have, yes, Professor Wendy Anderson in the audience right now, who is one of these deans. So I think Wendy has seen me say this many times, but one of the genes that I found was around about the level of Professor Wendy Anderson there. Not the single master controller at the top, but I was still really excited to have been able to find a gene that had so much control over what else happened in the plant by cascading messages down to lots of other genes. So although my mutation was capable of we say conferring salt tolerance on the plants, we also noticed that on this one-off plate that got infected with mold on the left there, there's no wall in the middle of that plate. That's just a line that I've drawn to help draw your eye to it. But there was no progression of that mold over towards the plants that I'd grown on the right-hand side. And so that raised the question, is my gene responsible for also fighting off pathogens like molds and yeasts and things that would infect a crop, which added to the excitement in my research. Cheat meme. So the question that I'm trying to, or the message that I'm trying to get across here is that when I had started my research with the question, how do we solve the problem of salt toxicity for crops? The approach we took was, first of all, let the plants tell us how they naturally do it. And maybe the way that we do that is by finding out what potential is already there in the plants. Okay, we made some starter changes to see if we could maybe turn on genes that don't normally get turned on, or turn off some genes that don't normally get turned off. We turned on one of these sort of Dean level genes and it cascaded through to having lots of effects. And then the message we can take from that is maybe in the crops, all we need to do is turn these pre-existing mechanisms up to 110% rather than 100%. And maybe that makes them capable of growing in places where it's too hot or too dry or too salty right now. And so when I'm talking to people about my research, although what I did was I moved tiny volumes of colorless liquid from one tube to another for months and months and months, and then got some small results at the end, which is part and parcel of how research works in science. What I actually tell people is that if we can figure out the answer to this big question, then maybe we'll be one step closer to being able to feed the world. And so, hopefully, what you'll see as you go through the rest of the presentations today from our fantastic presenters, who've all been working with us and with their mentors to shape their presentations, is that they've all got their own research, which is very in-depth and very detailed and very laborious in most cases for the people who did that research. And what they've done today is packaged up all of that in a way that hopefully is accessible to you, no matter which subject you've come from, no matter which level you are working at. I've just noticed the message Andrew said there about reducing my research down to plant cooking. So if that's the accessible message that you take away from it, I cooked some plants to see if they survived. Okay, I showed you the salt example, but I also put some in a hot oven to see if they would survive. Think about the things that you're seeing today and the ways in which they've been made easy for you to understand, because we want this to be as instructive for you as an audience member as it has been for the participants in getting ready for these presentations. Ask your questions in the chat, put comments in the chat, ask your questions in the Q&A, and also to give you the full conference experience, if you're to have a look at Twitter, every conference has a hashtag. I've seen from today's stuff that we are on hashtag LTAX22, so you can join in or just watch the conversation there.